Continuing with the with chapter 5 on organic chemistry, we're going to move along. This is Calvin sitting at a desk. Says, I wonder how long it's been since I last looked at the clock. Maybe it's been an hour. Well, actually, it's probably been only 40 minutes. I'll guess half an hour to be safe. 20 seconds? It's going to be a very bad day. And then you can see the teacher going, Calvin, sit up. I'm sure watching these videos, you're getting some of that feeling. Well, this is where we were. We just talked about carbohydrates. Now we're going to talk about lipids. And I'll write this down once I get that thing out of the way. Lipids. Lipids have two basic components. They've got a little molecule with 1, 2, 3 carbons on it. That's called glycerol. It's a little slimy. And when you use dehydration synthesis to build these things, what you attach is a very, 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 very long string of carbons that's called a fatty acid. Is that it can lose hydrogens to the surroundings. Remember, acid, hydrogen ions. Things that lose hydrogen ions into the juice are acids. Things that lose hydroxide ions into the juice are bases. And sometimes these things connect. This one connects, and instead of having 3 hydrogens, each one of these only has 1 hydrogen because there's a bond, an extra bond in between the carbons. And that kinks the string. Now this will come up later, I'll write it down later. This would be an unsaturated lipid because there's a spot there that you could put more hydrogens. There's a double bond rather than this one having an extra hydrogen and this one having an extra hydrogen. Oops. I have too many places to put these things down. So we have lipids. When you say sugars and starches for carbohydrates, you've covered most of the carbohydrates. And when you say used for energy, you've talked about most of the functions of sugars. It is true in our bodies, we have little markers on our cells so our immune system knows who's us and who's not us. And a lot of times what makes one marker different from another is we pin some sugars on it to make it readable as us. Other than that, in most of what we run into, sugars are basically energy. Starch is stored energy. Lipids, fats, oils, and a lot of other things. So you've got that 3-carbon glycerol, and fatty acids attached to each carbon. Now later when we talk about cell membrane molecules are phospholipids. 2 fatty acids on 2 of the carbons and 1 phosphate group on the other one, which makes it hydrophobic on one end and hydrophilic on the other. What the heck does that mean? We'll get to that. It'll show up before very long. Now here's a confusing term. We tend to connect the word saturated to water. That's not what it means here. It just is a chemical term meaning it's holding everything it can hold. If there's a double bond, that means the bonds could be used to hold on to other atoms rather than hold 2 atoms together doubly. So if it's got all single bonds, as many atoms stuck on there as there could be, it's saturated. If it's got any double bonds, it could have 1, could have 2, could have a bunch of them, it's unsaturated. And this does not just apply to lipids, but this is where you hear about it. You hear about polyunsaturated fats. What does that mean? Well, it means that the lipids have a bunch of double bonds. Poly means many. Or saturated fats, which have all of the hydrogens it can hold. So that's why I talk about it here. Because remember, fats are lipids. One of the big ways that lipids get used is because of the way that the electrons go around the molecules, they do not get surrounded by water molecules and floated. They don't dissolve. They are hydrophobic, which kind of sounds like they're afraid of water. That is kind of what the Latin word means here, is that it's fearing or not liking water. But something that's attracted to water is hydrophilic, P-H-I-L, also from the Latin word for liking. And something that doesn't like water is hydrophobic. And so a lot of the uses are connected to that. These are often used for water barriers. Whole bunch of cells piled on top of one another, very flat. Cell membranes make this a pretty good water barrier, or we would dehydrate into the atmosphere. As it is, we're not the most waterproof critters in the world, so we can dry out, once you die, you can dry out. But it is a pretty decent water barrier, and it's a great water barrier for each individual cell. You can have a bag full of water chemistry going on inside a cell, and the membrane kind of makes that a separate blob of chemistry from the cell next to it, or the juices around the cell. So water barriers, also, like if you go to buy a house plant, if the plant has shiny leaves, then that plant evolved in dry conditions. And it has an extra layer of kind of a waxy substance to try to keep as much water in the leaf and not let it evaporate out. Plants that evolve in wet conditions, that isn't as big an issue. They're somewhat waterproof the way we're somewhat waterproof. But in dry conditions, they will add an additional wax layer. Honeybees seal their larvae inside these wax chambers or fill them up with food for later with honey. And the wax is hydrophobic, is a water barrier. If you see a duck go underwater and come back up, you see the water just bead up and run off of them. Their feathers are coated with an oil that is repellent to water. So there's a bunch of different ways it's used as a water barrier. I'm squeezing stuff in here. So you have a heaping big old bowl of Captain Crunch for breakfast, and all of that sugar goes into your system. What's in the Captain Crunch is either high fructose corn syrup or cane sugar. And we'll say cane sugar because that works better for what I'm going to explain. Remember I said cane sugar is glucose and fructose stuck together. Goes into your digestive system, you break them apart, you absorb them. Now you get a whole bunch of glucose. This goes flooding past your pancreas before it gets into your general circulation. And your pancreas cells are literally out there going, oh wow, that's way too much sugar. And they will release insulin. Now as your blood comes out of your digestive system, goes past your pancreas, goes into your liver before it gets into your general circulation. Insulin goes to your liver cells, attaches to a receptor on the liver cells that basically says to the cells, get some of this sugar out of here and hang on to it. So your liver cells start to grab glucose molecules, and once they're in there, they string them together, dehydration synthesis, into a long starch, glycogen. The sugars are pretty reactive, the starches are less so. So it's a good way to store something, is that you want to store something in a not terribly reactive form. sometimes you've been eating an awful lot of Captain Crunch. And your liver cells, they get the message and they go, we're full. Well, I really don't have any place to store any more sugars. So be free, insulin. Go find somebody else to bother. So the insulin goes into your general circulation. Now it also will attach to muscle cells who will store sugar for their own use as starches. So your muscle cells will, if they're not full up, because they've been working, is if they're not full up, they'll take some of the sugar and store it. But once they're full up, they won't respond either. Your fat cells are the third line of storage. They have weaker receptors. It takes a while for the insulin to actually get to them. If it's been used up in the liver, it's not out there. But it will attach to fat cells. And the fat cells go, what? Store sugar? We don't store sugar. Oh, we can store the energy from the sugar though. How about that? So what your fat cells will do is they'll take the sugar in, they'll pop it apart for the energy, but they'll use the energy to build lipids, to build fat molecules. So they fill the cell up with a big blob of fat. Now, that is, like any lipid, hydrophobic. It basically becomes I talked about you want storage to be kind of non-reactive. You don't get much more non-reactive than something that won't even mix with the water in the first place. So a big blob of fat in the cells might just well be a big rock, except it's got a bunch of energy in it that a rock wouldn't have. And so that's one of the ways you hold on to long-term, but it's long-term, is that if you want that energy back, first place you're going is to your liver and go, okay, break those starches down and give us the sugar back. Your liver goes, okay, boss, does that. Your muscle cells are using it. They're not letting it go. Your fat cells are like, you need energy, go bother the liver. We're not getting into this until you really, really need it. And so getting rid of fat is a little bit trickier when you're trying to thin down or lose weight. And what some people do is they go on a low or no carbohydrate diet. What does that do? Well, if you're not putting carbohydrates into the system, your system is going to storage for carbohydrates. So it's going into your liver and going, okay, give it back. But if you're not replenishing it with your diet, your liver will eventually go, we're all out. We don't have any starches stored. Your muscles are going, yeah, we neither, is that get us some energy. Then your fat cells are going, well, I guess we're it. And it's much easier to get the fat broken down and used for energy, and this goes away a little bit easier. I should say that in some people, the process of breaking all this stuff down, you also will go into other molecules for energy, like proteins. And a lot of those breakdown products will release hydrogen ions into your blood. Hydrogen ions, acid. Now your kidneys are pretty good at clearing that out. So for some people that's a nothing, it doesn't really matter. But in some people, you wind up with acidification of the blood. The pH of your blood should be pretty stable. If it gets a little too low or a little too high, it doesn't have to wander much on the pH scale for it to have bad effects on you. So some people definitely don't want to be on low and no carbohydrate diets because their systems can't handle it. But it's, not everybody, it's rare. So if you decide to go on a crash carbohydrate diet, you just have to watch out for some downsides. Now this isn't a big use of lipids, but in things like walruses and whales, if you need to protect yourself from the cold, you need insulation. And the cheapest form of insulation, if you're building insulation as a living thing, is to cover yourself with something with a lot of air pockets in it. Just like storm windows, is that heat doesn't travel through an airspace terribly well. So you keep the heat in, you don't lose it to your cold surroundings. And that's what downy feathers or fur are for. The problem with that kind of insulation is that if you're a diver the deeper you go, the more the water squeezes the air out of your surfaces. And if you watch fur seals diving, you'll see bubbles coming off of their fur. But they don't dive that deep. So they don't dive so deep that all the air is squished out of their fur, in which case it's not an insulator anymore. If you're going below, I don't know, 20 feet, 30 feet, then if you're using fur or feathers as an insulator, like penguins use feathers, then they're not going to be terribly effective. Maybe if you're diving and coming up really fast, like penguins do. To go any deeper, you need a type of insulation that will still be an insulation under pressure. And that's what blubber is. Blubber is a fatty insulation. The thing is, though, it's protecting you from losing all of your metabolic heat to the cold, so you can't really use it for energy once you've got it in place. It's metabolically expensive to build, and you have to maintain it, or you can't feed yourself. So you don't find it in a lot of places being used for insulation. I mean, it's people, if we're a little heavier, we are insulated a little bit from the cold, but that isn't really why we put that on. It just happens to be a side effect. Now, hormones come in two varieties. There's protein-based hormones, insulin is a protein-based hormone, and there's lipid-based hormones, better known as steroid hormones. We build them, one of the building blocks of lipids in our digestive process is cholesterol, sterol, and that stero shows up in a lot of these, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, is that, which is a signal that you're looking at a steroid hormone. These are built out of the same molecules as the cell membranes. So these type of signaling molecules can go up to a cell, and instead of attaching to a receptor and asking nicely like insulin does, could you please take sugar out? And the liver goes, no, we're full, get out of here. Steroid hormones come up to the membrane and they go, and they just work their way in because they're made out of lipids the same way the membrane's made out of lipids. So the membrane's not really a barrier. And a steroid molecule can go into the cell and actually turn on directly whatever the heck it needs to turn on. In some cases, it goes right into your nucleus and turns on certain genes. So in terms of making things happen faster, they can be more useful than that. Speaking of moving into cells, squeezed right into the bottom here. A lot of poisons that are produced by living things are lipid-based so that they can invade tissues very quickly. Poison arrow frogs is that they catch these brightly colored frogs. They're brightly colored as a way to saying to the world, you do not want to have me in your mouth. Leave me alone, I'm really poisonous. But some poison arrow frogs, the toxins are so poisonous and they're based on lipids that just handling them, getting them on your skin, the toxin goes right in through your skin and you get, it is powerful enough that it can actually kill a human being just from handling the frogs. When people make chemical weapons, is that once they realize, oh, people are wearing gas masks, well, where are we going to get the toxin, the gas into them? We got to go in through their skin. Then they came up with lipid-like molecules that are absorbed through the skin. A lot of pesticides also, in order to get absorbed by the critters you're trying to poison, are lipid-based toxins. Now, one of the problems with some pesticides is they use molecules that are steroids that are kind of similar to some hormones. And we found that some pesticides we put into the world actually get into the local animals and mess with their reproductive. Remember progesterone and estrogen and testosterone? A lot of reproductive hormones are steroids, and some pesticides will mess that chemistry up. And so we're kind of trying to back off from that. Okay, that's the lipid part of the chapter.